I am thrilled, I am so pleased to introduce you to Dr. Debra Thompson, who is an associate professor of political science and a Canada Research Chair in racial inequity in democratic societies, a leading scholar in comparative politics of race and a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists. Her research, teaching, and public scholarship seeks to analyze the complex, historic, and contemporary relationships among race, the state, and inequity, inequality in Canada and other democratic societies. There's so much to say about Dr. Thompson. She's an award-winning writer. Her first book, The Schematic State, Race, Transnationalism, and the Politics of the Census, was a seminal book in terms of racial classifications here in Canada. And of course, her best-selling second book, The Long Road Home on Blackness and Belonging, I identified so much with based on the history of what I just shared in terms of the boomerangs around the world that form so many of our identities. It's equal part personal meditation, penetrating analysis, and pointed social critique of the dynamics of race and belonging over time and across the Canadian and US border. If you have not read it, please get it and please read it. It is worth it. And so The Long Road Home, no surprise, won many awards, top 100 books on the CBC Best Nonfiction lists, the Hills Times Top 100 Books, winner of the Canadian Political Science Association Donald Smiley Prize, and so on. So many prizes associated with that book. I'll end by saying that Dr. Thompson is also, of course, a frequent commenter in print media, radio, podcasts, was in the 2022 Black Ice documentary, a regular columnist for the Globe and Mail. You are in for a journey. And so, without further ado, Debra, I welcome you to the podium.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Yabome, Jennifer. I love coming to SFU. It's like coming home. Everyone's so lovely. Chris, Naomi, thank you so much for that welcome as well. It was beautiful, and I'm so honored to see you all here. So my name's Deb Thompson. I am really happy to be here today to talk a little bit about Black History Month in the times that we find ourselves in today. So I think that for me, at the core of Black History Month is this tension. So on the one hand, Black History Month is about writing Black Canada into a history that largely ignores us, in which we are largely absented. Our history has often been erased. We are considered to be newcomers to this country. Many Canadians don't know about Black history, don't know that slavery existed here for over 200 years, don't know about legalized segregation, don't know about centuries of Black activism. Marcus Garvey had chapters in Montreal. The Sleeping Car Porters Union was instrumental in fighting for civil rights. And so Black History Month is about reconsidering the entirety of Canadian history and making Black people integral to the retelling of that story. And on the other hand, we're in a moment that is characterized by a very real, very dangerous backlash against racial progress and other forms of social justice. It manifests in a lot of ways, certainly the attack on critical race theory, the use of woke as a slur, the denial of systemic racism, continued police violence against Black communities. And after the largest mass uprisings we've ever seen in the summer of 2020, every Canadian city increased its police budget. So on the one hand, Black History Month is this celebration of resilience in the face of ongoing, violent domination. And it is necessary to celebrate that resilience. And on the other hand, there are very real critiques to be made about the existence of racism right now. And I think that like this tension, for me, has always been the defining element of being Black in Canada and in North America. I don't want to be anything but this. Like, just so we're clear, we talk a lot about oppression, a lot about domination, a lot about like the trials and the hardships, but like I don't want to be anything but Black. Thank you. I have a hard time describing to non-Black people how awesome it is, you know, to be Black, like what it feels like when you're walking down the street and you see another Black person, and what do? You give a nod, and they nod at you, and you don't know them, and it's so special. It's such, you know, we talked about cousins and kinship, right? Like that's what it's like to have access to like this culture and the joy and the jokes, you know, and we were talking last night about the phrasing, you know, what phrases did your parents say to you growing up? And like my dad used to say things like, don't take any wooden nickels, and if you do take them, make sure they're real wood, you know, just like that kind of thing that to me really defines the Black experience, you know, the music, the song, the joy, the culture. It's amazing, and it's also hard. Right? It's hard sometimes. There are layers of racism that like are like a weight. Every Black woman I know has an autoimmune condition. Too many of us die too early. My father has had 3 strokes. And a lot of this can be attributed to just the stress and the trauma that racism does to our minds and our bodies. And we feel bad about things that are happening to people who look like us. So in political science, this is a concept we call linked fate. And more than any other racial group, Black people in North America feel that the things that happen to our kin, the things that happen to people who look like us, could just as easily happen to us, right? And so that's why when police violence happens against Trayvon Martin, who would have been 30, you know, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, so many other Black people who have died at the hands of the police, our outrage is in part this knowledge that it was arbitrary. It could have been us. It could have so easily been one of us. So I want to talk today about 3 things, very, very, briefly. One, what does contemporary Black Canada look like? So the answer actually might surprise you. It surprised me. 2, how does racism manifest in the Canadian context, and how is it different than what we think of as racism? And 3, how do we think of this moment that we're in right now? So let's start. What does contemporary Black Canada look like? And is this question familiar to anyone? It's not where are you from, but it's where are you from? No, where are you really from? Right? Because when you say I am from here, the answer is to many people like unimaginable because there are no Black people in Canada. But of course, there is a very long history of Black people in Canada. It began as early as 1628. The first person who was bought and sold in what is now Canada, his name was Olivier Lejeune. Actually, we don't know his name. He was baptized Olivier Lejeune. And we don't know anything else about him other than that he was the first person enslaved, first Black person enslaved in this country. Most Canadians don't know that slavery existed in this country for over 200 years. In fact, the original Underground Railroad followed not the North Star, but the Southern Cross, right? Because northern states in the United States abolished slavery. Most of them had abolished slavery by 1786, whereas Canada didn't abolish slavery until 1834, when it was ended in Canada and the rest of the British Empire. So in fact, the Underground Railroad was originally constructed to smuggle slaves out of Canada into the free northern states, and it only switched directions after the first Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. So beyond those people who were enslaved in Canada, we generally speak of 3 waves of Black migration to this country. The first, as Yabome mentioned, were the Black Loyalists. So these were about 3,000 Black people who fought for the British Crown during the American Revolution in exchange for their freedom. And after the British lost that war, they were promised land and freedom in Nova Scotia. As well, though, important to note that some people who fought for the British also went to Nova Scotia and took their enslaved Black people with them. So the Loyalists were both free and enslaved Black people who came to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick after the American Revolution, approximately 3,000 of them. But just after a few years, over half of them decided to leave because, as Yabome said, the conditions were not what they were promised. And they, along with the Jamaican Maroons, left and founded colonies in Sierra Leone. The second wave of Black migration are people like my grandfather's grandfather, Cornelius Thompson. So these are the Black people who escaped slavery in the United States through the Underground Railroad and came to Canada. Now, the records here are sketchy, but an estimated 10 to 30,000, the records are sketchy, up to 40,000 people could have come through the Underground Railroad to what was then called Upper and Lower Canada. But most of those people left at the end of the Civil War to go back to the United States to find the people that they had left behind or who they had lost along the way. So it's those two main groups of Black migrants, the Loyalists and the refugees from slavery, that make up the bulk of Canadian migration for nearly 100 years, because Canada had a white-only immigration policy in place from around 1888 until 1967. There are a few blips, which I'd be happy to talk about. But for the most part, Canada banned Black immigration. In fact, the 1910 Immigration Act provided the federal cabinet with more discretionary power to enable border agents to turn away any migrant who could not acclimatize to the, quote, climate or culture of Canada. And border agents used this to turn away, for example, farmers from Oklahoma who in 1910 wanted to help settle, quote unquote, the prairie provinces. And those Black farmers from Oklahoma who were turned away at the Canadian border went back to Tulsa, and many of them were then massacred in the Tulsa massacres of 1921. So the largest and most recent wave of Black migrants to Canada happened after '67, when the federal government changed its racist immigration policy. And in 1971, when Pierre Elliott Trudeau declared that Canada was a multicultural society, the Black population was actually quite small. It was just 34,000 people. My dad used to joke that if you saw another Black person in Toronto, when he was there, he grew up in Toronto in the 1950s, he used to say if you saw another Black person in Toronto in the 1950s, you were probably related to them because there were so few Black people in the country. But through immigration, the population changed pretty dramatically. So in 1991, there were 500,000 Black people in Canada, and by 2021, the census counted over 1.5 million Black people. We are around 4% of the national population. So I know this is hard to read, I apologize. StatsCan has just put out a really great profile of what the Black population in Canada looks like, and I was pretty surprised by some of the dynamics that I saw. So some highlights. The Black population has doubled since 1996, and Black people are expected to become the second largest racialized population by 2041. Over about half of the Black people in Canada are immigrants. Interestingly, there are some shifting dynamics around what comprises the Black population. So 42.5% of Black Caribbean immigrants migrated earlier, right, between 1960 and 1990. But now the demographics are changing, and Black migrants from Africa, from the African continent, outnumber Black Caribbean immigrants significantly. African and Canadian-born Black populations together are 73.6% of the Black population. And the Black population is incredibly diverse. So Black populations, we hail from over 180 different countries. We speak 250 different mother tongues. This is the most linguistically diverse group in the country, period. And we report over 371 different cultural or ethnic origins. Nearly all Black people reside in urban centers, unsurprisingly, with the vast majority residing in Toronto, then followed by Montreal and Ottawa. And we are very young, 41.9% of the Black population is under the age of 25. Other kind of notable things that I thought were interesting. So among the Black population, there are nearly 10,000 Black people who also report having Indigenous ancestry. And so we, in contemporary Black studies, Black politics, there's not a challenge, that's the wrong word. We do not know how to properly enumerate Black Indigenous people, in part because the census requires that you identify as Indigenous and then skip the race question. But this population is growing, and when given the chance to identify, it turns out is quite significant, or at least more numerous than we had thought in previous years. And in 2021, Black populations also had the highest numbers of religious affiliations in the country. So over 80% of Black people identify with a Christian denomination. So what does this all mean? Three things. One, incredibly diverse Black population in Canada. In fact, the StatsCan report calls it Black populations in the plural, because you really can't speak of a Black community in this country. It is fractured and fissured by language, religion, ethnicity, generational status, and more. Secondly, because the population has grown so substantially since the 1990s, this is in my lifetime, it's in many of your lifetimes, our population is in fact quite new and comes largely, even as there are historic Black communities, it comes from migration. And a lot of my friends who came to Canada from majority Black countries tell me things like, I didn't know I was Black until I came to Canada and someone called me a racial slur. And so when we talk about fighting systemic injustice, we need to have conversations about immigration and immigrant integration with those, we need to embed those conversations. And finally, I think about Black Canada as being the diaspora of the diaspora. Our presence here is the outcome of these global collusions of imperialism and the transatlantic slave trade. There's no doubt about that. But we do not have the same kind of political or cultural recognition as African Americans, and we don't have the sheer magnitude of the millions that comprise the Black populations of the Caribbean or South America. Okay, so how does anti-Black racism manifest in the Canadian context? So one of the things I think that's become clear in the past 2.5 weeks, it's the longest 2.5 weeks of my life, is that Canadian nationalism is kind of latent. It's been really interesting to see everyone get real mad about tariffs, and all of a sudden we're all Canadian again. It's cute. It's real cute. But one of the things I think that is a constant theme of Canadian nationalism is that, we are not American, right? What else unites us? We don't know, but we're not American. And we don't want to be. And this comparative logic that has always informed Canadian nationalism, it has ramifications for how we see ourselves in racial terms. We understand in Canada that American racism is real and morally repugnant. And so in comparative terms, Canadian racism either doesn't exist, or if it does exist, it's not as bad as it is in the United States, because that's the real racism. And I think that there are a few reasons why Canadians mistakenly think this way. The first is the way that the major, most significant cleavage in Canadian society has historically been conceptualized as this division between the Anglophone and the Francophone parts of the country, or as I live in Quebec, so as Quebecers say, between Quebec and the rest of Canada. But the bilingual nature of Canada is fraught. And it creates really interesting racial politics, especially in Quebec, where white Francophone Quebecois see themselves as victims of Anglophone domination, and they reject their complicity in both settler colonialism and ongoing forms of domination and, frankly, racism. At the same time, white Quebecois generally refuse to recognize the existence of not just racism, but race It's a kind of an astounding thing. Or the fact that the construction of Quebecois identity isn't actually about language, but is really this ethno-nationalist conception of who can and can't belong to Quebec. I can talk more about that if you would like. The second reason that we believe in this kind of like American racial exceptionalism is Canadian multiculturalism. So in 1971, Pierre Elliott Trudeau stands up in the House of Commons and declares that Canada is a multicultural society. But at the time when he did that, 98% of the Canadian population was European descended. Right, so Canada, when he declares Canada to be multicultural, Canada is in fact not multicultural in terms of racial diversity at all. And in fact, part of the reason why multiculturalism policy emerges is to shut down the growing nationalist resentment, or nationally, I shouldn't say resentment, the growing nationalist sentiment in Quebec. Right, Trudeau uses multiculturalism to really take the wind out of the sails of the arguments of Quebec sovereigntists. It backfires, but that's what it was intended to do. But the most relevant reason why this idea that race exists in the US and not in Canada, the most, I think, important reason is because of the way that America has shaped so much of Canadian national identity. It shaped our psychoses, our narratives, our identities, our obsessions, and it's all been quite important. Throughout our history, we in Anglophone Canada, at least, have really struggled to form our own national identity. And it's understandable because it's hard to share a border with the world's only superpower. And because there are a lot of similarities between Canada and the US, being Canadian is in part defined by being not American. And so the logic is racism exists in the United States, Canada is not America, ergo there is no racism in Canada. But of course, there is, and the data are quite clear here. We have persistent socioeconomic disparities in employment and unemployment, even when you account for levels of education. There are wage gaps that are significant and gendered, even at executive levels. Poverty rates are higher. There's a disproportionate number of Black children in child welfare. 2/3 of Black people say that they occasionally or frequently experience racism, and 8 in 10 say they experience daily microaggressions. Black entrepreneurs cannot get funding for their projects. There's discrimination in housing and real estate markets and rental markets. More disturbing, perhaps, is the way that Black people tend to experience democracy through the punitive arms and the violent arms of the state. So there's tons and tons of research that demonstrates that Black people are disproportionately stopped, carded, charged, arrested, and subjected to use of force by law enforcement. And we are so overrepresented in the criminal punishment system. I don't even call it the criminal justice system anymore. We're so overrepresented in the criminal punishment system that the situation, which has been called the new Jim Crow in the United States, if you take the proportion of the Black population that is incarcerated in Canada, it's actually even worse here. We are 4.3% of the national population and 10% of the federally incarcerated population. And of course, it's even worse for Indigenous people, who are around 4% of the national population and 25% of the federally incarcerated population. Systemic racism also operates differently in Canada than it does in the US. I will die on this hill. This is something I struggled to come to terms with. I think when I moved to the US in 2010, I thought that racism in Canada and racism in the US were quite similar, and I was actually wrong, I think. So in the United States, systemic racism is the result of policy legacies, right? And what I mean by that is, why do we still see neighborhood segregation in the United States? Well, redlining and zoning policies. They create these institutional configurations and these interests which persist even after the laws and policies which were explicitly racist aren't on the books anymore. And in Canada, we can't point to those explicitly racist policies in the same way. They existed, don't get me wrong, but they targeted a very, very small population. Again, we're talking about like 30,000 people kind of into the 1980s. So what are the mechanisms that sustain systemic racism in Canada? And this is an ongoing project that I have. And I think that, like, my hunches are that one of the ways that systemic racism is sustained in Canada is through discretion, right? Well, a hallmark feature of the parliamentary system of government is that we give street-level bureaucrats discretion to discriminate, right? So in 9 out of the 10 provinces, for example, who lays charges? It's not prosecutors, it's not the Crown, it's the police, right? That's discretion. Police have the discretion to lay the charges. And to me, that is like a failure of a check and balance on the system, right? I also think that there are exclusions that are built into our universalistic laws and policies. We have ineffective anti-discrimination policies. We do not have data purposefully in some cases. And of course, there are just racist people who have positions of power. We can't forget that. There are racists out there. Speaking of which, how do we how do we characterize the moment that we're in right now? So there was a brief moment of capitulation, even before the George Floyd protests of 2020, when things kind of started to change. So, people have a lot of hate for Trudeau, and like, fine, whatever, I don't love him, it's whatever. But the Trudeau government has expanded the social safety net quietly in a way we have not seen since the 1970s. Like, really, like universal daycare, the changes to EI, the changes to the pension program. Like, it's a silent expansion of the welfare state in ways that people haven't been haven't like rewarded his government for. And the Trudeau government has done quite a bit in terms of actually trying to tackle systemic racism. So there have been 2 Canadian-wide anti-racism strategies, the first in 2018 and the second just last year in 2024. We see anti-racism legislation in Ontario, BC, and Nova Scotia. The Trudeau government created the Supporting Black Canadian Communities Initiative, and a Black Entrepreneurship Fund, so those entrepreneurs could get money to start their projects. Stats Canada has created a new disaggregated data action plan, so we finally have disaggregated data on different racial groups, and because that big category of visible minority hides so much. The Black Canadian Justice Strategy has issued its report and made like 70 recommendations on how to completely overhaul our criminal punishment system. And there's been a review of the Employment Equity Act, which recommends extracting Black people from that category of visible minority, racial minorities, because of the specific circumstances of anti-Black racism. These are huge developments that, like, in a very short time. And this is really promising, except that we are living in a moment that is characterized by a very real, very substantial, and I want to point out, organized backlash to DEI and progress and social justice of all kinds. The beginning of the attack, and people talk a lot about Florida, and like, I think we can blame Florida for a lot of things, so yeah, Florida. So we see like the attack on, it's a terrible place. We can see the attacks on critical race theory, the challenges to educational curricula in certain states, the fall of affirmative action in 2023 by the American Supreme Court, the Stop Woke Act in Florida. And in Canada, I feel like the backlash is taking a slightly different form. It will still be very bad come this next election, but in Canada, there's a general feeling that the left has gone too far. I hear that. I hear that a lot. I have an article coming out in the Globe and Mail this Saturday. I don't know what the title is. My white editor said it should be called "Don't Say Goodbye to DEI," and I was like, "You're going to get me beat up." No. like we can't, they'll revoke my black card, please name it something else. So I don't know what the title of the piece is, but it's a piece on the backlash against DEI in corporate Canada. And I make a number of points in that article, but just to give you kind of a preview, the critics of DEI are purposefully misconstruing its power and its purpose. while simultaneously leveraging this anti-woke sentiment, this anti-woke rhetoric to fuel a simmering sense of grievance across the population. People think DEI is much more powerful than it actually is in this country. People think there are quotas and preferential scholarships and preferential hiring, and DEI here does none of that. It's a very different legal framework than exists in the United States. We're going to talk more about this shortly, I believe, but for now, let me just say that no one wants a meritocracy more than Black people. Right? Like this. So let me just conclude by saying, in studies of social movements, we talk about the moral battery that's necessary. So that means that we are mobilized by the bad and the good. We are mobilized by both foreboding and by hope. Those two things have to exist together. And I wanted to end on a hopeful note because I always get asked about this in my talks. It's can you please give us some hope? That was a lot of doom and gloom. And I agree. And I want to say that I left this country in 2010 to work in the US, and I came back in 2020. And in that decade that I was gone, there was a very real shift in how people were talking about race in this country. Really, really. When I left in 2010, well, one is I left because I could not get a job in this country because Obama was president and racism was over. And secondly, when I left, nobody was talking about white privilege. That was not a term in our lexicon at all. And now my students do have this much more sophisticated understanding of things like racism and settler colonialism, and it's really, really heartening. But our resilience requires vigilance. Right? I wrote a piece for the Globe and Mail in December, and the title was something like, Trump is headed back to the White House, and where is the resistance? And I think that, if anything, that the past 2 weeks have shown us is that we really do need to organize and resist and strategize, because the folks on the other side of the aisle who, might still be good people, I don't want to demonize those people, might still be good people, but they have been organizing for decades. And so the downfall of DEI, the backlash that we see or we find ourselves in right now, this is the outcome of decades of strategizing and organizing. And to combat that, we need to do the same. So let me end there. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. How are you?
Good. Is this on? Hi.
Yes,
Okay.
it is on. I'm going to pick up right where you ended, because that was one of my questions. What would you say to folks that are thinking about working on trying to navigate, continuing to do social justice work broadly, right? Given the realities, the data, the evidence around the continued systemic inequities and anti-Black racism specifically, in this moment, what would you say to folks about how to navigate this moment and do the work?
Yeah, years ago, I heard Michael Hart speak. He and his co-author wrote a book on empire. And he was talking about Occupy, if you remember Occupy Wall Street. And people had said to him, Occupy is over, what's the next steps for the movement? And he said, Occupy it's not over, it's like a root system. Sometimes you see the sprigs, burst through the soil, but there's always stuff happening underground. There's always stuff happening even when it doesn't look like it, there's always stuff happening under the surface. And I think of our need to strategize, mobilize in that way, that even though things right now on the surface are not in our favor, if you are interested in social justice, as I am, the climate is not great right now, but it will be, and when the window of opportunity opens for us to mobilize, again, we need to be ready. And this is part of the reason why Black Lives Matter was successful in 2020 is because the legwork and the messaging had been done, right? So Black Lives Matter emerges in 2012 after Trayvon Martin is killed, and then it resurges for the second phase after Mike Brown is killed in Ferguson, and then it gets kind of quiet for a little bit, and then when 2020 happens, like the networks are already in place, like people are ready to go. It mobilizes very, very quickly all across the country and all across the globe. And so right now, in this moment, when it feels quite dire, this is actually the best time to find your people, to come up with plans, to think about how to resist. And also as a political scientist, if I could just do a pitch, y'all need to vote. For, really, the voter turnout in this country is horrific. It really is. And I know the first past the post system is not great. I can't imagine what it's like to be in BC and then like everything's decided before the polls close. Like that sucks. I understand, but we need to vote. Because I have very real fears about what is proposed should a Poilievre government win, which it probably is in fact going to happen. I think that what has happened in the US is a blueprint for what could happen here, and I think we really need to organize to ensure that doesn't happen.
Okay. This event was called Black Futures in a Changing Geopolitical Landscape, and partly how do we navigate the now is also about what do Black futures look like given the historical timeline you took us so wonderfully through. What do Black futures look like in this changing landscape?
That's a great question. I mean, what does a socially just world look like? To you? Like I'm interested, and to me, the way that I typically answer this question is like, I want Black people, and people get mad about this answer. So wait until don't get mad. I want Black people to be able to be mediocre. Okay, and here's what I mean by that. Like, I was brought up with the very real the principles of Black excellence, right? The principles of like, you have to work twice as hard to get half as much, so you better work twice as hard. And like, I don't want to work that hard. I'm tired. And I have an autoimmune condition. My body is trying to kill me, like literally. And I want Black people to be able to be like mediocre, like to have anxiety and messy kitchens and to have fun and be joyous and just live, right? And so to me, an anti-racist world is literally one that enables Black people to live in like the messy complications of being human without like that weight of when you hear there's a tragedy and you are Black, the first thing you think is like, oh my God, I hope that mass shooter wasn't Black. Because if that mass shooter was Black, that's gonna be bad news for me, because white people think that we're all, the same. Like that lone wolf excuse that's not afforded to Black people. And so, yeah, my hope for a socially just future is that, and no more police, but, and a functioning welfare states, and a kind of capitalism that isn't based on exploitation. What's your idea of a just like small things? It's fine. It's fine. What's your idea for a...
Nice try. I'm going to bypass that for a second because I want to maximize the time hearing from you. I have just a few more I want to quickly ask and maybe leave room for a couple from the audience. I want to pick up where you said in terms of the ability for Black folk to just be. As part of that vision of Black futures. And we spent time together yesterday, and you talked about just how big and heavy and busy your regular faculty role is and can be. And so what would be your advice to emerging Black scholars, in particular, scholars or activists, interested in addressing social inequalities in democratic societies where that kind of levity in terms of support for your words and work won't be there. You know that already.
Yeah.
For example, you joked about the title of your Globe and Mail article and just being able to sit with all of those things that will come if you are a Black scholar, and by that I mean specifically studying the kinds of issues that you studied.
Yeah. Okay, let me say a few things that I think I've done right in my career. And one was that I listened when people gave me advice. I used to carry around like a little notebook, and I would ask people, "What do you wish you knew when you were in my circumstance?" And I would write it down, and I got really great advice, and I was very careful about it. I also I let people help me, and this is hard, right? Because academia is competitive, right? It's premised on competition. We make our students compete for all kinds of things, including funding. And help is rare, and there's always the danger that people will steal your ideas. You know, there's always like the backstabby saboteurs, and God knows I've met them. But when people offered to help me, I let them, and I frequently help people expecting nothing in return, but it always comes back on me. You know, it really does. There was a visiting, when I was a PhD student, there was a visiting scholar from Ohio State, and there's a Black man, Nick Nelson, and he was treating me like I was his RA, and I was not getting paid. But I was like, all right, there's this like Black guy from Columbus, Ohio. He needs someone to help him like figure out Toronto. No problem. Like, I'll do it. And then, you know, a few months later, he emailed me and he was like, come to this conference. I will introduce you to everyone I know. And he did. He did. He took me to like the American Political Science Association, and he introduced me to every Black political scientist who was there. There aren't that many of us. There are like 200 of us, right? But like, he introduced me to everyone he knew, and those connections, I still have them. You know, and so that kind of like spirit of, I will help you, I will help you, and I will accept help when it is given. It goes against a lot of what we're taught in the academy. It really does. But it's been so important to my career. And especially the help of I'm just gonna say, like, there's been a lot of white dudes who have opened doors for me, for real. There've been a lot who have tried to ruin my career, but there have been also some who have opened doors for me and who are willing to like use their power in that way, and I'm really grateful, and also I accepted their help, like, absolutely. They wanna squander their white privilege on me, like, cool.
You'll take some. So let's stick with academia for a moment. Many of our institutions, SFU, McGill, signed the Scarborough Charter to support Black flourishing within the academy for all of these reasons that you've been talking about. What would a breakthrough on the Scarborough Charter commitments look like now? I think we were both at the last Scarborough Charter conference. We've kind of seen what people are doing across the country, what's working, maybe what is not so much. What would breakthrough look like?
Oh my gosh. You know, the Scarborough Charter is so good. It's such a good document. It really is. And I am so tired of these great reports on what we need to do, like being written and then sitting on the shelf, and nothing happens. You know, the New Brunswick had a commissioner on systemic racism who issued like a 400-page report on systemic racism in that province. It's a really, really comprehensive report with like hundreds of recommendations, and very few have been implemented. But for me, because, you know, my first book was on the census, as you mentioned, for me, if we could get data, that would be incredible. And I mean data on the student body, I mean data on graduation rates, data on faculty, on staff, and kind of like how that trace, evaluate over time. Data's not everything, but it would be so powerful, especially in an environment where everybody wants evidence in order to make policy changes. You can't make policy changes without evidence, but they don't want to collect the data to get the evidence. So like just having the data is such a necessary first step. At McGill, we know how many francophones, we know the languages that people speak, but we don't know anything about like the racial makeup of our student body. It would be such a good start, at least.
And we've started that journey here. Just a little thank you to Jennifer, that's part of that task force that's doing that work. And a quick pitch, if you have not read the Scarborough Charter, and please do read it. And of course, colleague Dr. Adele Blackett, who is also an SFU honorary degree recipient, was the principal drafter of the charter from all the conversations, as well as the lead who reviewed our Federal Employment Equity Act, and that document is also phenomenal. Lots of engagement across the country, lots of rich information in there. If you haven't read that one, also please read it.
And Adele she's now working for the UN. She's now like the executive director of the International Labor Program, I think. So she is a superstar.
Yeah, and she's worked for ILO before, I believe, as well. Okay, so last question, and then I'm going to do just to prepare the audience, rapid fire. I think we'll probably have time for 3 rapid fire questions and rapid response, which I know you can do. But before that, at dinner yesterday, we ended with a bit of a sobering question from somebody at our table, which was, what do we tell our children about the current state of the world and the future they're inheriting, given the challenges of now? What's your response?
Okay, I'm going to tell a very quick story about my son. His name is Theodore. So Montreal teachers were on strike last year for 6 weeks. So my children were coming with me to class. And I was teaching a class on Black Lives Matter, and it's a bummer. I teach students about police violence for 13 weeks. It's really hard for them. And I was trying to think of how to end the class on a hopeful note. And I was sitting with my children on the bus home, on the city bus, and Theo kind of like, he was sitting and I was standing, and he said like, "Mom, what's that?" And he pointed to the ceiling, and I was like, "Oh, it's the emergency exit." Like that's, and he was like, "Why is it in the ceiling?" And I said, "Okay, like if we can't get out of the bus, like that's just another way to get out." And he was like, "Why would we need it?" He's 5. And I was like, just in case the doors are blocked. Like, that's how we get out. And he's like, "How would I get up there?" And I said, "You would stand on my shoulders. I would lift you up." And he's like, "But what if you aren't there? How am I going to reach it? How am I going to get out?" And he is genuinely upset because he is 5 years old, and everybody on the bus is listening to this conversation because he's loud. And he's crying, like he's very upset. And he's like, "What am I going to do? How would I get up there?" And I was like, "Theo, look for the helpers. Like, people will help you." And he's still upset, and I was like, "Okay, fine." And so I turned to this woman who was sitting across from us, and I said, "Excuse me, if my son needs help, would you help him?" And she said, "Of course I would." And then I turned to the person, there's like this 20-year-old guy sitting in front of us, and I said, "Excuse me, if my son needs help getting to the emergency exit, would you help him?" And he said, "I'd absolutely help you. Would you help me?" And Theo said, "I'd help you." And and it was just like this moment of connection. And like it reminded me that like we help each other, and those moments happen all the time. Those moments where like we help each other happen all the time, and we can do that again. And so like I think that we tell our children to look for the helpers and to find solidarity and to, and to take solace in the fact that like there are people who are good and who care and who will fight, and that to me, I think like that's what I tell my kids.
All right, can we snap for that? Yeah. Thank you. It's beautiful.
That is a true story, by the way, that 100% happened.
Yeah, that is definitely a mic drop. I see water coming out of faces, which is a good thing. Thank you. All right, we have time for rapid fire, very rapid. Thank you. There's a mic that will be run. Who has a question? Just put your hand up and a mic will come your way.
Thank you so much. I'm so intrigued by all the things you shared. I was curious about the language we use. And just yesterday, I work in equity and inclusion in a nonprofit setting, and I received a suggestion for perhaps rewording the work we do to advance equity and inclusion. And I noticed that U of A recently changed EDI to access, community, and belonging. So I was wondering your thoughts on the language.
Is there any other questions? No.
All right, let's see if there's other, maybe then you can answer them all together and we save time. Who else has a question? That's a great one, thank you. Don't be shy.
I can answer that
Let's
question.
start with that one.
Okay, thank you for that question. I have a line in this op-ed that's coming out on Saturday, and it's like 3,000 words, which the Globe never does. So it's great that they gave me that space. And the line is like, the name can change, but the work must not. And one of the arguments I make in that piece is that a lot of what we call DEI in Canada is actually just our basic human rights obligations.
That's right.
Like, for real, it's our human rights codes, the charter, which I know like universities are not public entities in the way that the charter applies. That was decided in the 90s, but like there are human rights codes that mandate that we do not discriminate in like hiring, retention, promotions, termination. Like, this is law. This is law. And that the point I tried to make in this article is that like, one, like this is law. This is jurisprudence. This is not the way DEI operates in the U.S. Like, you want to undo DEI? Cool. Like, to undo the charter, you need a constitutional amendment. Good luck. Go for it. And the other point, this piece didn't make it into the final edit, but I did say something like, my original thought was something like, if like the modicum of progress that we've made towards equality in the past 40 years has been too much for some people, y'all, you should just say so, right? Just say, if you don't like DEI, what you're actually saying is like, you don't like our human rights legislation, right? Just say that then. That's cool. You can undo that if you want. It'll be very unpopular because Canadians love the charter, including those on the right who use it all the time to talk about like their rights, right? Anyway, thank you for that question.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. I see a hand. Was there anybody else? I'm just scanning the room so we can do this quickly. Go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering, is there anything that maybe other racialized communities can do to help with the situation? Because definitely I think that our racialized communities should connect with each other to better the lives of everyone. Like, I don't want to use better the lives of everyone, but that's what I can think of at the moment. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. This is where it's the terminology of racialized minority and visible minority is so problematic because it implies a solidarity that has to be forged, right? And so, Chris, you were up here earlier to talk about the connections between Black and Indigenous people. That takes work. We have to work at that. We have a lot of history to undo, including, I write in my book about how some indigenous nations in the U.S. owned slaves, and Black people were buffalo soldiers and murdered indigenous people. We have histories of us doing bad shit to each other. And so, oh God, this is being recorded. Sorry about that. I curse word. And so, like, solidarity is forged. Solidarity is forged. And this is part of the reason why I think that racialized communities need to take really, really hard looks at like the anti-Black racism that exists in those communities as well, like for real. And I think Black communities need to take really hard looks at the things like homophobia that is pretty rampant in our communities. Like we don't get a pass either from doing this really, really hard work. And this is where, like, again, like nuance is so important. We need nuance, because these are groups that are non-white do not necessarily have the same interests. There's no reason why we would. Solidarity is forged, right? It's forged through the struggle.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'll take the last one. I know we're right at 4, but let's take the last one.
Hi there. Just a quick question. With all that's going on, how do we keep hope alive?
How do we keep hope alive? So look, I'm a political scientist, so I like politics, and for me right now, this sounds backwards, but like, don't look away, right? Because the strategy right now is a bombardment of, especially, you know, what President Trump is doing is to bombard us with so many executive orders that you cannot possibly keep track of all the bad that's happening, and that's the strategy, right? The strategy is to overwhelm. And the way to combat that is to take account, right? Like, we cannot afford to, because like any one of those executive orders, if they go through, that's bad for it's going to hurt so many people. And so like I know it's hard and it's overwhelming, but like we cannot look away. We have to remain like vigilant. Don't let it slide. Like what Elon Musk is doing is it's essentially a takeover of the government, the most powerful government in the world, and we need to pay attention, right? Because apathy is the danger, right? Indifference is the danger. That to me, that's the real danger of the situation.
Thank you so much. Well said. What a great conversation, and I'm sure if you yes.
Thank you.
Certainly sparking a lot for me, so I encourage all of you, write your notes, take what was sparked, run with it. Keep hope alive by staying alive and awake to what's happening, and let's all do our part. Look for the helpers, and be willing to help and be a shoulder for others to stand on. And for me, my access to hope is actually that. It's the reminder of the shoulders that I stand on. It's the reminder of my parents coming here in the 60s and also seeing very few people that looked like them in that context, and persevering through to do what they came to do, and making choices for our family that I am enjoying the fruits of today. It is in the work that has been done to document the history and of our communities, plural, and write them into Canadian history. And on that note, loved your naming of the first enslaved person that we know of. And many also don't know that the first documented Black person in Canada was a freed man that arrived as an interpreter in the late 1500s called Matthew de Coster. So on record, the reminder that Black people existed in a storyline that predated the reasons why we have Black History Month. We're a whole people group and community with lives like everybody else. And so how do we go back to the future and document the history into the canons so that we can make the future that we all want? Because we live in such mutuality when our communities, including all marginalized communities, as our colleague here has reminded us of, are uplifted, we will all be better as a human society. So look for the helpers, go well. Lord Nation will play us out. We're officially closed, but we're here for at least another half an hour or so. Enjoy the music, engage with Dr. Thompson, and be well.